if anybody's listening and they want a consultant who they pay a lot of money to and doesn't need to say anything on the stand, I'm your man. I can do that. In fact, I don't even mind what topic it is. Yeah, on the ancestry of French bulldogs, fine.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Thoughts. My name is Ruaridh Gilmartin.
My name is Arianna Clark. Today on the show, we are very excited to have Dr. Neil McDonnell, who is a Lord Kelvin Adam Smith Research Fellow at the University of Glasgow and who works on topics concerning immersive technologies, causation and safety engineering.
Dr. Neil McDonnell has moved between the technology industry and academia throughout his career. After a couple of postdoctoral positions, he settled into positions that focus upon the relationship between virtual reality and philosophy itself.
As well as having the longest research fellowship title known to man, Neil is a proud father of 3 children, a keen photographer, and by all accounts, one of those lecturers you love to listen to, even when they tell you terrifying stories about the future of AI.
Here are some thoughts about causation.
Hi, Neil.
Hello.
How are you today, Neil?
I'm very well. I'm looking forward to talking your ear off on my topic of choice.
What is your topic of choice, Neil?
I love causation as a topic in philosophy. The philosophy of causation. It's a kind of branch of metaphysics, which puts people who don't know what it is off as a title. But I think a lot about what caused what, how we might be able to figure out what caused what, and how we talk to each other about what caused what.
So Neil, you've used the word causation a couple of times now. Could you go over like a rough definition of what you mean by causation? Not necessarily theory, but maybe what you mean by it.
Yeah, so I mean that's exactly what is being contended, is how we ought to define it. So I'll stay away from a definition, but I'll just give you some characterizations, right? So we think that causation, for the most part, is that relationship that goes between cause and effect. And sometimes we signal we are talking about this in language when we say X caused Y, or sometimes we use it when we use the word because. Although because is a bit ambiguous between whether or not we're talking about causation or explanation. Now you might think that explanation and causation are very closely linked. I do. And some people have even thought there aren't ways of giving an explanation as to why something happened in the world without giving some information about how it came to be, how it was caused. So there I've given you a paraphrase. Causes are how things come to be. You also might think about causes as things that make a difference to an effect or an outcome. So causation is a notion that we pick out in different ways in our language, and we use it in slightly different ways, but we use it all the time. And the concept we use in just about everything that we do. So when you click the 2 record buttons there, Ruaridh, you were making something happen, right? You were initiating the recording of the session. And that is you causing something to take place. You did so when you turned the tap on. That was to cause the water to flow. Maybe when you press the brakes in the car to cause it to stop. When you press the button on the kettle, and so on, and so on, and so on. Even the words I'm saying just now are to cause you to think or say something back, right? So that is the notion that we're trying to get at. And when you think about those kind of mundane everyday examples, causation is everywhere and always in our lives and in our thoughts. It is then somewhat embarrassing that when you ask me for a definition, I've spoken this long and not offered one, right? So philosophers are trying to figure out what are the conditions under which we do have a cause and where we don't, what rules there are around it. If you maybe think about a parallel that I'll come back to, I'm sure, in the other things that we talk about, of gravity. So gravity is the mass attraction force, and it operates at the proportional to the inverse square of the distance between, and so on. Right, we've got rules. We can define this thing that we talk about that makes apples fall to the ground on Earth, but makes large bodies draw together to each other. Gravity is a feature of the universe, the world we find ourselves in, and we can describe it. Now, if causation is a feature of the universe, the world as we find it, then it's somewhat embarrassing we haven't been able to get to the point that we got to in gravity by giving it sort of necessary and sufficient conditions, giving you an account of what it is. There is an alternative, though. Maybe causation isn't out there in the world. Right? Maybe causation is a feature in how we think about the world. We project it, perhaps. And the analogy I like to use here, although it's slightly controversial, is maybe like beauty. So a kind of naive view of beauty is that it is in the eye of the beholder. That's a way of saying that a certain thing isn't just beautiful or not beautiful. It depends on who's looking at it and what they think of it. Is that the same for causation? Right? Did my pressing the button cause the kettle to boil? Is that just a function of how I think about the world? Is that a function of the way the world is? Now, I prefer the latter. I think it's more like gravity than it is like beauty. But that's where the philosophical challenge is.
That's really cool. I can see why for academics and scientists and everything like that, the examination of causation is very important. But why would our listeners care? Maybe they're happy with not having a proper definition, just using their common sense language. Why would a listener care about knowing what causation is?
I think for most of the time, the listener will do no harm by simply listening to their gut and running with it. In particular, because when we do the philosophy of causation, we start off with examples that everyone can agree on, pressing the button for the kettle or whatever. But there are various ways in which we've found that people can sort of be disagreeing and not understand why, when that disagreement boils down to something in the way that they're communicating about causation, and sometimes in their preconceptions about causation. Now, the fields of your life where you might come across this would be maybe in your interactions with the law, right? So people can be held to account for things that they did and for things that they did not do, right? You failed to do something. You were negligent in some particular respect. You did not put your seatbelt on, for example. These are things that you didn't do, right? But you can be held to account for. You can be held responsible for. And there's a causal issue in there, right? What do we consider to be the sort of thing you can be blamed for? Is it only things you cause? Well, it seems like not. So we need to try and untangle issues around causation when it comes to the law. So in the law, you might see that. But one of the areas that I've worked on that has this sort of practical import is in the realm of safety engineering and aeronautics, right, in planes. So when they're about to put a new component on a plane or roll out a new type of plane altogether, what establishes that that thing is safe? Right? So we can test out any given plane, but what if we change a couple of components around? Do we need to go through the full testing thing with that plane again? Or do we just take it that the components have been tested separately, and when you just put the two things together, that makes them safe enough? There are really difficult questions about how much testing we ought to do before we put hundreds of people in metal tubes that fly through the sky. So causation really is everywhere. But these are ones where you might imagine hearing some of the disagreements where a philosopher's thinking on the matter might be helpful.
So Neil, you're talking about like the seatbelt example, crashing the car, someone goes flying through the window, kills someone else. But isn't the crashing of the car a cause as well? Is there cases where you can have more than one cause and it's difficult to tear them apart?
Interesting. There's a philosopher called Peter Unger who argues that around the grammar of the word cause, that cause is singular. It picks out just one thing, right? There is just one cause. And I find that heroically implausible. It's similarly the case that so many factors add up to a particular outcome. And the idea that we want to cite one as the cause on a particular moment just belies some of the things that we are interested in, maybe because of norms, maybe because of what we could have influenced. If we think about normal causal chains, and again, the classic example is just like a domino run. So if you tip over the first domino, it tips the second, which tips the third, which tips the fourth, all the way back to the last one that falls. And then we'll say tipping the first one caused the last one to fall. That seems like an obvious thing to say. But equally, tipping the third one caused the last one to fall, and tipping the fourth one, the fifth one, and so on. And I can just go and list everything that's on that causal chain. They all count as a cause of the thing that happens at the end, you might think. So then Unger might say, it's only the last one that really causes, or something like that. And you say, well, wait a minute, which step in the falling of the last domino? Was it where it set off in its trajectory? Was it when it was halfway there? Was it when it was halfway again there? And we can kind of Zeno's paradox this into having almost infinite causes even in that very last step. So the idea that there's just one cause, I think is, as I said, heroically implausible.
So I've got a question. What if you'd set up two tracks of dominoes leading into one track, and the last two dominoes of each track fell into this singular track at the exact same time? You could say that both caused the continuation of the dominoes. So are both causes, or is one a cause, or is...
Yeah, it's a really important question and a difficult one. So when David Lewis was talking about this. He thought that when he applied his theory, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but when he applied his theory, that neither would be considered a cause, right? Because if you were to remove one of your two contributing paths, the later path would have fallen exactly as it did anyway. So in other words, removing one path would have made no difference to the outcome. Therefore, things that make no difference to the outcome can't be causes. Therefore, that one path, call it the left-hand path, can't be a cause. But then we go back to the start of our reasoning, and then we start in the right-hand path, and we get to the same conclusion. So now, whilst we know by stipulation that when you knocked both paths starting, the right and the left path, right, you definitely started a causal thing that ended up with the last one falling, but now we have to say that neither path is a cause. So this is known as the problem of overdetermination, and it applies to anything where the outcome has two sufficient causes, two independent sufficient causes, right? And David Lewis's answer was that neither is a cause, and that was deeply unsatisfying to most people. I happen to be quite unsatisfied with Lewis's response, but I'm equally persuaded by the thought that we ought not to be saying they're both, common or garden causes of the outcome. I think what we ought to say is that they overdetermine the outcome. Now, that sounds like cheating, right? I've just given the name and shut up. But there's a bit more to it. So if I think that my theory can tell the difference between cases like that one, for example, or ones where we needed both dominoes to fall to tip the first one in the next run, that's a case of joint causation, right? If we want to tell those two structures apart, we need to know different conditions that would obtain. So in the overdetermination case, we say the left-hand one was sufficient and the right-hand one was sufficient. And the second one, we say the left-hand one was not sufficient, the right-hand one was not sufficient, but jointly they were sufficient. I feel like I've described all the bits of the case that you need to know. And I haven't come down on saying cause or not cause or overdetermination. I haven't given it names. So once I'm able to use my theory to show you what makes one sufficient, what makes the joint one sufficient, I can give you all the detail about that. What label we then attach to it at the end, cause, overdetermine, or whatever we want to say, I really don't mind. Say whatever you want at that point. I think it doesn't matter what you call it. So I think in our theories we ought to say that's a case of overdetermination, and here's the way in which my theory can articulate the different contours of that. And then I think you've said enough. And that's the sort of thing you'll hear from, I think, one of the more prominent, more recent people is a guy called James Woodward, or Jim Woodward. And that's the sort of thing he says too. I think that's the right response to those cases. But they are really troubling, and they have persuaded a lot of people. This is one of the cases that persuaded a lot of people that Lewis was wrong in his initial theory.
When you're talking about the dominoes, you say quite a lot of times, if it hadn't have happened. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that exactly? How does that work into causation?
Yeah, so the paper that got me interested in the topic of causation was called Causation by David Lewis. And in that, he argued for what is known as the counterfactual theory of causation. And I would argue that every sort of plausible theory of causation these days, all the leading contenders, are in some ways descendants from this view. Now, the counterfactual part of the counterfactual theory is that we have to think about situations that did not happen, right? And for Lewis, what it is for one thing to cause another, right, for my throwing the rock to cause the window to break, is for it to be true to say, if I hadn't thrown the rock, the window wouldn't have broken. So in the real world, I threw the rock and the window broke. You can hear the sirens already as the police come to get me. But in a counterfactual reasoning, we say, if I hadn't thrown the rock, how would things have been different? Well, one way we can presume they would have been different is the window wouldn't have broken. Now, before Lewis, that kind of talk sounded unrigorous in an important sort of a way. People thought, well, if you hadn't thrown the rock, then now you're just playing an imagination game and you can say anything you want. If you hadn't thrown the rock, the world would have been made of candy floss. I mean, you can say anything you like. But Lewis, together with Robert Stalnaker in the 1960s and early 70s, kind of developed this semantics, these truth conditions for sentences that have this counterfactual conditional structure. So I say, if I had not thrown the rock, then such and such wouldn't have happened. And this kind of reasoning is the one that Lewis thinks is extremely intimately related to causation. And his first theory, which he later developed and changed in various ways, his first theory said what it is for one thing to cause another is for them to be connected by chains of counterfactual dependence. And counterfactual dependence is that relationship between the windows breaking and my rock. The windows breaking depends upon my rock throwing, because if I hadn't thrown the rock, the window wouldn't have broken. So when we were talking about dominoes, I was trying to think through the scenarios where, of the two paths you gave me leading into the additional path, I wanted to think about scenarios where you sort of magically remove one path and how things might have gone, and then put it back and magically remove the other path and see how it goes. So what Lewis has done is he's taken the idea that causation is making a difference, and he's given us a philosophical analysis of making a difference by making us think about things that did not happen, counterfactuals, and how things hinge on each other in the real world, so that if the first one had not happened, the second one wouldn't have. So that's why I keep saying, if X had not happened, Y would not have happened type of idea when I'm talking about causation.
Okay. It's now making me think of, have you seen The Good Place, Neil?
I have indeed, yes.
Yes, so you know how Chidi is always very, very worried about the ethical ramifications of everything he does, but it does make him very anxious about any decision he makes because of all the possible outcomes and everything.
Yes.
Do you ever feel a bit anxious about what you're going to do next and the ramifications, the causal chains that you might set up, the dominoes you might push over?
I don't, and I think it's maybe because, unlike Chidi, I'm not in the grip of feeling responsible for every ripple in the pond that I create. I feel responsible for the ones that I could have reasonably predicted or the like. Here's one place where that's different, and I think it's an interesting, again, practical case, which is the kind of notion of that you see again in films and crime shows in America of felony murder. So the idea is that you did something you shouldn't have done. Maybe it was just you broke a window in a car to grab its radio or something relatively minor like that. But that's a felony, right? Now, if in the course of doing that you scare the person in the back of the car who you didn't see to the point where they have a heart attack or something, right? That can be felony murder, right? Well, maybe not murder, but you are held accountable for each of the consequences of, even if they weren't anticipated by you or directly sort of in any way your intention, but when you commit a felony. So this is the way in which that even if you didn't pull the trigger in a firefight that takes place after a robbery, if you were the robber, you can be charged with felony murder, right? And that's the sort of sense in which you're responsible for everything that happens once you misstep, right? So once you break a norm, this is a bit like the seatbelt case, right? So you can be responsible for all sorts of things that happen afterwards if you deviate from a norm in some way. And I do feel that a little bit. I do feel like, if I do something I shouldn't do, and even if it was completely unimaginable to me that it would take place further down the line, something bad happens, then I do feel the consequences of that. But if I just, turn left rather than right when I'm walking to the bus stop because it's, eachy peachy which way I go, I don't feel any particular responsibility for how that pans out next, because I didn't do anything wrong and I had no sense of anticipating how it might go. But I do think that's a major problem for consequentialists of a certain stripe. I think it's a flavour of the demandingness objection, right? It's super demanding upon any given person to try and trace all the things that could go wrong. And even as they sit down to do the calculations about all the ways in which things might go wrong, they're possibly making a choice by sitting down to do the calculations about all the things that might go wrong, that make things go even worse again, right? So you can see how this becomes a kind of a perpetual worry for people if they take responsibility for all of the outcomes divorced from intentions. But since I don't think we should be doing that divorced from intentions, I don't worry about it. When my intention started off badly, then I bear responsibility for all sorts of things that go on next. But when I didn't, then I don't.
Yeah, it just sounds like a hamster wheel of terror if you keep going down that.
Yeah, I mean, sophisticated consequentialists have answers to all these things, right? But I remain in the grip of the worry, even when I've heard what they have to say on the topic. But then I don't work on ethics, maybe for a reason.
Is there anything that you want to plug? Is there anything you think everybody should read?
Interesting. I think if you are interested in this topic at all, If you've got a bit of philosophical training, like you're an undergraduate or something, then I would suggest going to read David Lewis's 1973 paper, Causation. As a kind of overview of all the different nooks and crannies of the debate, the Stanford Encyclopedia is always a terrific resource. Again, slightly higher level resource at times than you would want to unleash upon the unwitting and the not philosophically trained. But there are, people do talk about these things in magazine articles and whatnot, things like on The Conversation or whatever. I can't for the life of me at the moment think of a specific one, but that and seeing public lectures on the topic. I mean, the people working in causation that I know of tend to be really, really good at explaining it, right? Laurie Paul and Sarah Bernstein, Carolina Sartorio. These people are fantastic at getting the point across. So any sort of public lectures by people like that on the topic, you might find them on YouTube. Would be really quite good as well.
Thank you, Neil.
Thanks for that. It was good fun. It's good to have a blather about causation. Love it.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning in with us. Remember, you can access our previous episodes through Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Spotify, and Apple Music by searching Thoughts U of G. And be sure to tune in for our next episode. Bye, guys.